Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Thursday, the 10th of March. We'll start the programme tonight with an update of the headlines from day 15 of the war in Ukraine. A meeting in Turkey between Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Ukrainian counterpart Dmytro Kuleba ended with little progress appearing to have been made. In a news conference afterwards, Reuters reports that Kuleba said that no progress was made on a ceasefire and that Lavrov did not commit to a humanitarian corridor in the southeastern city of Mariupol, where Kuleba said the situation was most difficult. Lavrov also said that Russia would try never again to be dependent on the West. A humanitarian convoy trying to reach Mariupol on Thursday was forced to turn around owing to fighting. Reuters reports the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister is saying. An airstrike on a hospital in Mariupol on Wednesday killed 3 people, including a child, the city council reported. The attack wounded 17 people in the besieged port city, including pregnant women, doctors and children. Ukraine opened 7 humanitarian corridors, including the one from Mariupol, according to the country's deputy prime minister. The governor of Sumy said 3 columns of evacuees were leaving after a ceasefire had been agreed. The UK's Home Secretary has pledged to streamline the online visa application system for Ukrainians following criticism of her response to the crisis. Priti Patel said that from Tuesday, Ukrainian refugees would no longer have to go to a visa application centre to provide their biometrics before coming to the United Kingdom. The US Vice President Kamala Harris says she will discuss issues with Poland that will force Russia to pay a price for its invasion on the Ukraine. Reports Reuters, during a visit to Warsaw on Thursday, she also said that Poland was doing extraordinary work to help Ukrainian refugees. More than 2.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion 2 weeks ago. The UN Migration Agency said that of those who'd been forced to take refuge in neighbouring countries, 112,000 of them were third country nationals. Today, the UK has frozen the assets of 7 Russian businessmen, including Roman Abramovich, Igor Sechin, Oleg Deripaska and Dmitry Lebedev, after they were added to the country's sanctions list. Abramovich is the owner of Chelsea's football club. Deripaska has stakes in N Plus Group. Sechin is the chief executive of Rosneft, and Lebedev is chair of the board of directors of Bank Rossiya. Russia's foreign ministry has said Moscow will no longer participate in the Council of Europe, the continent's leading human rights organisation, founded in response to the humanitarian outrages of the Second World War. I'm joined tonight by a very, very special guest indeed, Taras Fedirko, who is a British Academy Research Fellow at the University of St Andrews and member of the Centre for Russian, Soviet and East European Studies, but more importantly is Ukrainian. He's a Ukrainian political and economic anthropologist focused on the Ukraine. He's recently returned from 3 months in Kyiv. His recent research is about the economy of war, militarisation of civil society and right-wing involvement in violence, and his previous work is in the political economy of media in the Ukraine. His areas of expertise include, obviously, Ukraine, political culture, elites, corruption, organised crime, the far right and militarism. Well, really, you're the expert we've been waiting for to come on to this programme. Just looking at some of these headlines I read out, 2 things strike me as being slightly strange. Russia saying that they would never again be dependent on the West. How dependent on the West is Russia in truth?
I think we need to understand the statement by Sergei Lavrov today in Antalya as part of a long-term attempt by Russia to seek a certain degree of geopolitical autonomy in a world which has, since the fall of the Soviet Union, been dominated by the US and the US allies in NATO. And the strike on Ukraine at the time when Western military powers are certainly not committed to any military action in Ukraine, are at their weakest, have been focused on China rather than any potential military conflict in Europe, That's been well chosen by the Kremlin and their military authorities. So from that perspective, Russia is playing a long-term game in which it's trying to assert military, geopolitical, political autonomy, showing its defiance, I think, to Western powers. And in that, so the statement about autonomy is very much aspirational, I think. A statement about, never been again dependent on the US and the West is very much aspirational. Of course, it doesn't describe the current reality in any meaningful terms.
But is that going to be at the risk of him invading other countries like Georgia and other places that he's already casting his greedy eye over? Moldova is the other one.
Vladimir Putin. I don't know. Right now a significant proportion of the Russian military is committed to the war in Ukraine. So I don't think they are capable actually of invading any other country. They're not particularly capable of operating, of carrying out the sort of operation that they wanted to carry out in Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're certainly advancing, but they're not making the sort of progress that they'd planned.
But then I think they thought they were meeting a force of 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers. They weren't realising they were facing the force of 40 million Ukrainians, and I can imagine that's quite a force to be reckoned with. He has underestimated, clearly, hasn't he, what he was going to face?
It's important to understand that it's not just Putin and this one individual who's in control of everything. I think there's clearly been some kind of failure in the military or security intelligence bureaucracy that is catering to the needs and the requests of the Russian leadership. And it might be that no one was actually expecting that the invasion would happen, and so they were feeding some sort of fraught intelligence about low Ukrainian capabilities that would please the leadership. And no one, it seems from what is emerging from various sources, it does seem that no one in the FSB, the security service of Russia, and elsewhere, actually, not even in the military, knew about the impending invasion, because they were told that it would not happen.
Did you think it would happen?
I think the best way to answer the question is to try to describe how it felt to be in Kyiv over the 2 months before the invasion. I left on the 7th of February and was going to go back, but the university, because of the FCDO advice, prohibited me from doing so. And over 2 months before the invasion, while I was doing my fieldwork in my field research in Kyiv, I was constantly being both ashamed because I felt alert, I felt very, scared to a point because we were seeing objectively a military buildup. We didn't know what it was for. We didn't know whether it was a tool of diplomacy or an actual tool of war. Everyone around me, my Ukrainian friends, my collaborators, were absolutely calm. They knew that it would be absolutely irrational on Russia's side to invade Ukraine because it would not achieve their goals. So I felt a bit ashamed because of my part Ukrainian, part foreign exposure, because of my connections to the UK university, that I could leave Ukraine. I was being told that I should leave Ukraine at the earliest opportunity. At the same time, I felt like them. I felt that it was irrational for Russia to attack, and so I was in this almost schizophrenic state. Half a day I would feel very scared and packing my emergency backpack and so on. The other half a day being absolutely relaxed and going to a cocktail bar. Sorry for that detail.
The other thing out of these headlines that strike me is Kamala Harris has claimed that they will force Russia to pay a price. That's empty threats, is it not? What are they going to do? I mean, you've made the point that the West are not prepared to intervene militarily, and there may be reasons, are good or bad, for that. And we'll talk about that later, perhaps. But Russia pay a price. It's the same as saying that Putin will be held to account as a war criminal. Unless he leaves Russia, he's going to be a war criminal who's judged in absentia. So it doesn't really mean anything, does it?
Well, it does mean to have it does mean something to have, and does mean a lot to have a proper process that would objectively assess the war crimes committed by the Russian troops in Ukraine. So here I would disagree with you. As for the threats by Kamala Harris, it does depend what kind of price they're talking about, right? I mean, the Western sanctions on Russia, they are quite meaningful in some countries, and other countries they are a bit less so, but they are forcing the Russian population to pay the price. And they are based on the theory that it would force Russian leadership to do something. But if they are willing to provide weapons to Ukraine, as NATO has been doing so far, then it does force the Russian troops to pay the price of invasion, I think. So
Just to
in that
clarify,
respect, it's
when I talked about the war crimes not meaning anything, I didn't mean the fact the war crimes are happening didn't mean anything. I mean, telling the world that Putin's going to be held responsible for that doesn't necessarily mean anything if there's nothing they can do about that. Interesting also, people have been suggesting that the assets of the oligarchs who've been sequestered both here in the UK and elsewhere should be put to the benefit of helping Ukraine recover after the war. Certainly we are talking, we'll learn about this a bit later, we are talking about billions. That would seem to be a fair thing to do, wouldn't it?
That would be the minimum thing to do, I think. I think if it does depend on how the war is going to end, but that would be the minimum thing to do. I mean, it puzzles me that the UK has waited for so long to introduce these sanctions on these well-known individuals, given them time to sell their assets and change their ownership.
Well, Abramovich is a classic example, isn't it? I mean, he's been talking about selling Chelsea and setting up a trust in order for the money to help Ukraine. And I was saying to people, wait a minute, this is his asset. He shouldn't be allowed to do that. Now he's not being allowed to do it, although, as we'll maybe discover it when I get to that story, there's a suggestion that the British government might let him off the hook and maybe let him sell it if they can prove he doesn't benefit from it. So the sanctions seem tough on the first reading, but I'm not so sure. I want to go back to those ceasefire talks that happened today in Turkey. High-level talks between Russia and Ukraine ended without a ceasefire as violence continued across the country, with conditions in the besieged city of Mariupol described as dire and desperate as residents run out of food. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said that there had been no progress in achieving a ceasefire in talks in Turkey with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in the first high-level meeting between the two countries since the Moscow-ordered invasion of its neighbour 2 weeks ago. Talks got underway amid an outpouring of international outrage over Russia's attack on a children's hospital in the strategically important city of Mariupol. The bombing of the 600-bed children's and maternity hospital that injured pregnant women was evidence of genocide, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said. The White House called the attack barbaric, while the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said she was convinced the inhuman, cruel and tragic act could be a war crime. The day after the attack, the International Red Cross reported that conditions in Mariupol were increasingly dire and desperate, as hundreds of thousands of people have no food, water, heat or electricity. In an audio message recorded on Wednesday, the organisation's delegation deputy head Sasha Volkov described the harrowing conditions in the city, with people reporting they'd no food for children and attacking each other for sustenance. Meanwhile, Ukraine's mayor Vitaly Klitschko reported that half of the capital's total population had left the city as Russian forces advanced on the city. Nearly 2.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the war began a fortnight ago. As refugees continued to pour into neighbouring countries, Ukraine's foreign minister and officials were pictured sitting opposite the Russian delegation as the brief talks that Dmytro Kuleba described as both easy and difficult got underway. In comments after the talks broke up, Sergei Lavrov said the hospital had been under the control of Ukrainian radicals and denied that any patients were present. He said the West had caused the conflict by forcing Ukraine to choose between Russia and the West. Dmytro Kuleba called for Russia to allow the evacuation of civilians from Mariupol. He said Ukraine was ready for diplomacy, but also able to defend itself, as it appeared that Russia would fight on and was seeking a surrender from Kyiv. It's a kind of false flag, again, that we're hearing here from Russia, claiming that this is all Ukraine's fault and there was no one in the hospital. That statement that he said the West had caused the conflict by forcing Ukraine to choose between Russia in the West. Is that an act of choice that you believe Ukrainians are making or make?
I think the one thing that forced Ukrainians in their majority to make a choice in favor of the West has been the Russian support for the rebels in 2014 and 15, and since then in eastern Ukraine and the Russian invasion. I mean, if you look at surveys and opinion polls in Ukraine, indeed, the Ukrainian population has been, the people of Ukraine have been quite divided in their opinions about where Ukraine as a state should move in terms of closer ties with Russia or Ukraine. Right before the Euromaidan revolution of 2013 and 14. Now, the revolution, together with Russian reaction to it, Russian annexation of Crimea, led then to Russian-supported rebellion in the separatist regions around Donetsk and Luhansk, and that in itself led to a much stronger support for closer ties with the West than there had ever been in the country. So I think Russia really, realistically, has only itself to blame here.
Well, I'm not suggesting anybody with any sense believes what Russia have said about that, but I think that's a strong point that you've made. Do you think, though, that we're at the stage where diplomacy is kind of had its day? Do you think there's going to be any chance of any sort of diplomatic resolution to the war?
I can only hope that there will, because the Russians are very slowly but surely advancing on all the axes, and especially so in the south, and they will keep promoting a potential diplomatic solution. The question is, what is meant by diplomatic solution? What is it that Russia is demanding that Ukraine do? And currently, it's surrender and an implementation of a set of demands that are really, really unpopular in Ukraine, and it would be seen as a surrender and capitulation. So I'm not sure how much appetite there is among the Ukrainian elites for the sort of diplomatic solution that Russia is promoting. At the same time, both President Zelensky and the Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said that Ukraine is ready to continue diplomatic meetings with Russia in all fora, both in Belarus and in Turkey, and directly between President Zelensky and President Vladimir Putin, in order to pursue an end to the conflict, because it's costing civilian lives.
How did Putin respond to Zelensky's direct request that they sat down together and met? I loved his comment that he's prepared to sit at that great big long table.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, where would they transport the big long white table? Would they take it to Turkey? More seriously, I know that not Putin directly, but Vladimir Lavrov, the foreign secretary of Russia, said that such an avenue is open and it can happen. However, some preparatory work would have to happen before the meeting takes place.
Going back to the question about does Ukraine choose the West and why it's choosing the West and why it's looking westward, there's 2 points. Obviously, Zelensky has asked that they have immediate entry to the European Union. I don't imagine that's going to happen. But where was Ukraine in regards to potentially joining the EU? Was it even a candidate country? What stage of negotiations were there? Had there been any at all?
So this is part of the sort of, I mean, this goes straight to the crux of the, let's say, the Russian beef with Ukraine since 2014. The revolution that took place in 2013-14 was over then President Yanukovych refusing to sign an association agreement, which is a free market agreement with certain extra with the EU, and kind of instead turned towards Russia. There was an offer of a very generous loan from Russia, and there were protests which turned into a violent revolution, which took down the Yanukovych regime. And since then, Ukraine did sign an association agreement with the EU, entered a visa-free travel zone and a free market. However, it was very slowly implementing the set of sort of legal recommendations and requirements that are part of the roadmap towards candidacy for the EU. And I think what Zelensky has done right now is he very cleverly used a major political opportunity that opened itself once in a lifetime, I think.
Mm. And do you think that looking towards the West is going to be affected? Do people in the Ukraine understand why the West are not prepared to escalate the crisis militarily, why they're not prepared to implement a no-fly zone? Do they understand and do they appreciate, or do they think it's an outrageous response from Europe?
I'm not sure how many people in Ukraine and also in the West do understand what a proper implementation of a no-fly zone means. That it means basically an act of open war between NATO and Russia, which is extremely, extremely dangerous. However, to people who have been bombed and whose relatives are dying and who are suffering without water, heating, and electricity under Russian occupation, Russian bombs, I don't think that these rational arguments cut that much. I think they are expecting some kind of help, and surely it's not coming from Russia, so they're expecting it from the West. I think they will be very disappointed that that help is not forthcoming, at least not forthcoming in the form that would be most effective in their opinion.
Well, there was talk of Britain giving planes to Poland so that Poland could give its planes to Ukraine. I don't know what's happened about that. And I think it was yesterday, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, didn't exactly break ranks with her European friends, but she did begin to say that maybe we had to rethink the position, if not about no-fly zones, about some additional help. And I think people are beginning. I mean, I know there are a lot of armchair warriors, and no one really wants to have the threat of nuclear war held above anyone, especially not us in Scotland, where we are, 35 miles or so from Britain's nuclear capability. But I'm sensing that some people and people in government in power, not necessarily in the UK, are beginning to think there needs to be something else that can be done. That sanctions are all very well, but they're not enough. What would you like to see Europe do?
I think let's look at what sort of situation could help reach a peaceful resolution of the conflict, also some kind of peace, right? What you have on the one hand is that there are certain incentives, which are very low for Russia with the current sanctions, to de-escalate, right? I mean, a promise of removing the sanctions from Russia in the future would create some kind of incentive, which, however, would be a very weak incentive given Russia's goals of kind of breaking rank with the Western-led international order. On the other hand, there are costs, and the costs are directly the military costs that Russia is bearing at the moment in Ukraine, fighting with the Ukrainian military. And the better the Ukrainian military is capable of fighting, the higher the cost to the Russian military and the Russian public, which is very averse to casualties in the Russian military. So in that sense, the West can keep, and I think should keep, supplying the sort of military supplies that have been happening. I think more can be done in terms of supplying anti-aircraft weapons. I think the U.S. has pulled a stop on the supplies of MiG aircraft from Poland to Ukraine, so that's not happening anymore. But there is a lot in terms of military help and humanitarian provisions, and also in terms of just keeping the sheer logistics of the war going between Poland, Romania, and Ukraine, that the West can be doing, which could help Ukrainian military fight Russia and therefore increase the cost of the war and probably bring it to the end sooner rather than later.
Because what you seem to be saying all the way through is that the longer this goes on, and even by slowing the Russian advance, the more likely it is that it will bring the war to an end, and the more damaging it's going to be for Putin at home. And obviously there is a lot of resistance. Well, not a lot of resistance. There is resistance in Russia to the war. I don't imagine for a minute it's anything like a majority, for no other reason that Russian people are not really being told what's happening because they're controlling the media. But that seems to be what you're saying. The longer this can go on, the more that Ukraine can be strengthened in whatever way, the more likely that this war will end with some solution, even though we don't yet know what that solution would be.
There is one option. I think the other option for ending the conflict soon is for Ukraine to capitulate. However, that would mean a Russian occupying government, because I don't think a Russia-imposed government in Ukraine would be able to survive the internal resistance and the guerrilla warfare that would immediately begin. So the only way for Russia to, as it were, win anything politically would be to impose some kind of occupation government, which would be incredibly costly and which would have internal repercussions for Russia. So short of that, I think a prolonging of the conflict in terms of supporting the greater Ukrainian capability to fight, that would certainly help reach a slightly better outcome for the Ukrainian population. The other side of that, of course, is that This means that Russian troops will be drawn into fighting in the cities and shelling cities, as they have been doing in Chernihiv, Sumy, um, uh, Mariupol, and Kharkiv and other cities, which means greater civilian casualties. This is not something that Russia had planned in advance. I mean, they wanted to enter swiftly and move through cities and take Kyiv, hoping that they would be met with flowers, I suppose. I mean, they've met resistance. And while, of course, Ukraine militarily wins from prolonging this conflict by slowing down the Russian advance, the civilian population loses.
Yeah, but as you say, the cost on civilians is horrific, and I think that's what's driving people wanting to do more, but to do the right thing. But if we knew the answer, then we wouldn't be in this situation. I want to just talk briefly about the sanction regime, because as we heard in the updates, there have been increased sanctions imposed by the UK. The Chelsea Football Club owner Abramovich is among 7 of Russia's wealthiest and most influential oligarchs who've been hit with sanctions by the UK in an effort to further punish allies of Putin over the invasion. Abramovich was found by the UK government to have received preferential treatment and concessions from the Kremlin, and through his business links been involved in destabilising Ukraine and undermining and threatening the territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of the Eastern European country. The Foreign Office said he was implicated through the steel manufacturing and mining company Evraz plc, in which he had a significant shareholding and over which he exercised effective control. It said the firm may have supplied steel to the Russian military for the production of tanks. Abramovich's assets have been frozen and he will be prohibited from making any transactions in the UK, as well as being subject to a travel ban. The share price of Evraz, a firm which is incorporated in London but with mostly Russian assets, fell by as much as 13% this morning after the announcement. Abramovich's personal stake was worth $1.4 billion at the end of 2021, but had fallen to $320 million on Wednesday evening. It's the first time Abramovich has been subjected to sanctions by the UK or any of its allies. The other Russian oligarchs hit with sanctions on Thursday morning were Igor Sechin, Oleg Deripaska, Andrei Kostin, Alexei Miller, Nikolai Tokarev and Dmitry Lebedev. Deprivaska was I can't say that man's name. Abramov, oh, well, you know who I mean. One-time business partner. Sechin was said by Foreign Office to have been Putin's right-hand man, and Kostin, Miller, Tokarev and Lebedev were labelled as part of the Russian president's inner circle. There was a suggestion some time ago that it was the oligarchs who were absolutely the people that Putin relied on. But the suggestion has been in the last maybe 10 years or 15 years, they've been kind of eased out, if you like, squeezed out in some ways. And actually, the people he is listening to now, which has probably partly led to the invasion, are his military personnel. The people who are closest to him are military men. But this report, which we've picked up, seems to imply that maybe that's not the case. I'm quite surprised that it says that Britain have found that Abramovich have received preferential treatment. I thought that was quite well known. How important do you think this is, that these 7 men who are fairly important in terms of their assets and the companies that they're involved with, how important is this move by the UK, or is it just a little too late?
Certainly too little too late. I'm not sure this is going to change the calculus in the Kremlin, or wherever it is that Putin currently is sitting in a bunker in the Urals, they say, because the personal fortunes of these men are not going to, they're nothing compared to the larger geopolitical game that Russia is trying to play. And of course, it's going to affect the way in which the oligarchs are voicing opposition, or at least certain kind of concerns about the war. I mean, Deripaska has been fairly vocal, I think, in for what it counts in Russia, with an opposition to the war. I mean, saying that he would support Ukraine. I mean, also because he has assets and a larger aluminium plant in Mykolaiv, which is currently a city slowly been enveloped by the Russian troops. So I'm not sure that these sanctions are going to lead to the oligarchs breaking rank. Also, after after the Russia's sort of fair isolation from the banking system and central bank sanctions and so on and so forth, I'm not entirely sure what happened from the collapse of the properties of even one oligarch. If you see what I mean.
Well, in another issue that's a case of too little too late has to be the UK's reaction to Ukrainian refugees. But it's been announced that the UK is to ease its rigid entry requirements for Ukrainian refugees, meaning those with passports can apply for entry online and only have to give biometric details when they're in the UK, Priti Patel has said. Excuse me. The Home Secretary's announcement, responding to an urgent Commons question from her Labour shadow Yvette Cooper, follows increasing criticism about the bureaucratic delays facing Ukrainians with family ties to the UK. Many have gone to Calais to find out they could not apply for visas there and were sent to other cities in France. A number of UK consular offices had very limited numbers of appointments. From Tuesday, Patel told the Commons such appointments would no longer be needed for Ukrainian nationals with passports. They could apply remotely and would be told when they could travel. In short, Ukrainians with passports will be able to get permission to come here fully online from wherever they are and will be able to give their biometrics once in Britain. SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford said, "I strongly and wholeheartedly welcome this long overdue U-turn from the UK government. Scotland stands ready to welcome Ukrainian refugees with open arms. The SNP has consistently called for the UK to have an open door policy, and it is a disgrace that it has taken the Tory government so long to change its position. We now need to see this change implemented without any further delay. This is a victory for all those campaigners who have forced the UK government into a U-turn, and I hope we can now ensure that people fleeing war will get the welcome they deserve." Given that Ukrainian refugees will be able to enter the UK from any port or airport, including Scotland, it's essential that the UK government works closely with the Scottish government and devolved governments to ensure a successful approach. Unless I'm reading this wrong, this isn't an open door policy. There isn't been a massive U-turn. This is not Britain saying anyone from the Ukraine can just get on a train and come. You still have to have family links in Britain. So it's still going to be a small number of people. I mean, they said possibly up to 200,000, and so far they've processed 500 visas. So I'm quite concerned that Ian Blackford seems to be, opening the champagne before it's ready. I don't think that this will make a difference in as much it will be quicker. But there is no way that Britain is going to do anything to give up its integrity of its borders to allow Ukrainians to arrive here in the way that they are in other countries. Am I reading that right, do you think?
You're putting a very polite reading. I mean, I think I would go further than that, and I'd say that Britain is the most punitive and restrictive immigration regime on the continent, that goes all the way from the absolutely abhorrent refugee policy that now is being slightly modified towards Ukrainians, but that's been just abhorrent to watch, the treatment by the Home Office and the visa force of other migrants to the UK, all the way to the way in which work visas are, are treated and processed, in the way and how much they cost. So a little fact that I'd like to repeat is that my personal work visa cost me £2,500 for 3 years. This is something that's about 200 times more than what it would cost in Germany or in Italy. Now, this is not a U-turn in terms of allowing Ukrainians to come into the UK, simply because of the number and the restriction on the sort of the categories of people who can apply. Not only do you have to have direct relatives in the UK, but these direct relatives, from what I understand, they have to be settled. That is, they have to have spent at least 5 years on a work visa and moved on from a work visa to a basically an indefinite leave to remain, or have another form of settlement, such as settled status for an EU citizen. So from that perspective, that is a major limitation Also because many Ukrainians who are, from what I know, present in the UK are present either illegally or they're present as nationals of Hungary, Romania, or Poland, in case where they hold dual nationality. And in some of those cases, or in many of those cases, they might not be settled yet as EU citizens in the UK. So from that perspective, it all sounds very nice that the Priti Patel has made some concessions where none had been made before, none had been made to Syrians and to others, but they are still minuscule and they do nothing to revert what is truly an abhorrent immigration policy in this country.
Yeah, I don't think the words Priti Patel and nice particularly go together. I work with refugees in my day job, so not, I would not disagree with you on your interpretation of the UK's immigration policy. Obviously, one of the things that Patel has been saying is that the reason that they're not just having an open door policy is that there is too much risk that people will get into Britain who are not Ukrainians. So Russians will get in, I suspect, to poison us all in our beds, and it will be a threat. Now, is there any credence to that? And if so, why are why are the other European countries not concerned about that? I mean, Poland have taken over 1 million refugees. Okay, they're next door. It's the easy place to get to. But notwithstanding that, Poland doesn't have a particularly welcoming attitude to some refugees, certainly not refugees of colour, if we're being really honest and frank. But do you think there's any credence to this security concern, or is that just smoke and mirrors?
It's just laughable. I mean, frankly, I mean, we've had it over and over again as a justification for the tightening of the immigration regime, and I think it's it's just plainly not true. I mean, that's all I can say. I mean, I don't want to give much more honor to Priti Patel and the government on those statements.
You're in Hungary at the moment. That's where you're contacting us from. What's Hungary been doing? Have Hungary had a lot of refugees from the Ukraine? Are they planning to offer sanctuary? Do you know what the position is? Because obviously Hungary is a country which very often looks fondly towards Russia.
And also not very fondly towards refugees from other countries.
No.
However, the situation has been rather different with Ukraine, partly, I think, because of the many family links and dual citizenship that some Ukrainians hold. I mean, dual citizenship is prohibited in Ukraine, but many people from Western Ukraine do hold a dual citizenship with Hungary because of their ancestry, but more importantly, because of a unified EU policy on migration. The EU were going to offer Ukrainians up to 3 years of no questions asked sanctuary on a separate track than a typical refugee application, for example, on a track which would allow them to study and to work. Hungary, however, disagreed, and as a result, we have now only up to a year with qualified continuation in particular cases, from what I understand. So in that sense, the Hungarian government's been trying to still play its own policy, which has been quite hostile towards Ukraine for various historical reasons. I mean, they've been partly right to do what they do, I think. Partly, I'm not sure what are the back channels of diplomacy between Hungary and Russia. However, at the level or at the street level, where the state is not present, you see a tremendous outpour of solidarity, as also in Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and elsewhere. I was yesterday at the train station to pick up my relatives who arrived from the western city of Lviv in Ukraine, and it's just heart-rendering to see how ordinary Hungarians are volunteering to support Ukrainian refugees. The Hungarian state railway company made the tickets free for all people with Ukrainian passport, especially if they're willing to travel within the country and abroad. And this is in line with what other countries have been doing. Hungary is offering some refuge. However, there is a language barrier in the sense that it's a difficult language for Ukrainians to learn because it's nothing like Ukrainian or other Slavic languages. So Polish, Slovak, or Czech are still preferable, and that's why many people go there rather than to Hungary. And also, Hungary is an economy which is doing worse than the other Visegrad four, so Poland, Czech Republic, or Slovakia, are worse than Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and others. So Hungary is a state through which many refugees pass on their way to other EU countries. I'm not sure, however, how many of them will stay.
And to be fair, that has often been Hungary's approach to refugees anyway. It's a transit country. We don't really want people to stay. We want to move you on. You were talking about the particular conditions in which a lot of Ukrainians who are in the UK are. And that actually leads to another story that we've picked up. And that's the issue of Ukrainian seasonal workers. Because if I think I'm right in saying that if you're here as a seasonal worker, you don't have the status which allows you to be a sponsor or someone to receive your family members. And that was raised in Holyrood today at First Minister's Questions today. Scottish Green MP, MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife, Mark Ruskell, raised urgent concerns about the support available for Ukrainian seasonal workers in Scotland, many of whom are currently excluded from the UK's Ukraine Family Scheme. It's estimated there could be thousands of Ukrainian nationals currently living in Scotland on seasonal worker visas, primarily in agricultural industries, many living in northeast Fife. Under current amended immigration rules, Ukrainians on seasonal worker visas will have their visas extended until the end of December 2022, but must continue working in a job that is permitted by the existing seasonal worker route and with the same sponsor. Those on seasonal worker visas will also remain excluded from mainstream benefits and support due to being subject to a no recourse to public funds conditions. The UK government today announced that they would be streamlining the process for visa applications, as we've already heard, for the Ukraine Family Scheme. However, it fell short of expanding the scheme's eligibility to include these on seasonal worker visas. No further sessions have yet been announced to support seasonal workers or their access to public funds or to secure immigration statuses for themselves or their families. Responding to Mr Ruskell's question in Holyrood, the First Minister agreed that the UK Family Scheme was horrendously bureaucratic and confirmed that the Scottish Government will continue to call on the UK Government to waive visas for all these fleeing the conflict. I think this is a really important point, actually, because I don't think people understand just how vulnerable people on seasonal worker visas are. The fact that they can stay till December the 2020 of this year is only if they continue working in that industry and only if the same employer sponsors them. But the key is in the word seasonal. If you are a fruit grower, you don't need fruit pickers in December. So you're not going to be able to offer people a job. So there's a real possibility that these people will lose their job. They cannot or should not be able to be returned to Ukraine, because that would be kind of refoulement. That would be sending people back to a country that's not safe. But because they've no recourse to public funds, they will become destitute. They have no access to any sort of housing benefit. They have no access to any in-work benefits or out-of-work benefits. Now, the whole issue of no recourse for public funds is an absolute disgrace. It's such a stain on Britain. It's unbelievable. And quite recently, there was a number of agencies were asked to give evidence to a Scottish Parliamentary Committee on no recourse to public funds. I was one of the agencies that did that. And we have been asking the Scottish Government, although it's a policy which is reserved to Westminster, we've been asking the Scottish Government to mitigate that particular issue. And they have the power to do that. They can mitigate any Westminster decision they want. They mitigated the bedroom tax. They could do something about that. And I'm hoping that this particular issue of Ukrainians will highlight that even more, because at the moment, everyone's very supportive of Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees, often, sadly, to the detriment of other refugees. But this might be the thing that makes the breakthrough to allow no recourse to public funds to be mitigated by the Scottish Government. But I'm really fearful of what's going to happen. And we've been reaching out to Ukrainian societies in Scotland to make sure that they know that if Ukrainian families come and they need the sort of support that my organisation offers, that there's a direct route to it. And this is the issue that they've raised with me. And I guess you'll be aware of this from knowing Ukrainians who are in Scotland. So do you think mitigating this would be a useful thing? I mean, I don't see Scotland, the Scottish Government, changing the Westminster Government's mind on this. Or what more pressure should be put on Westminster to make those people who are here from Ukraine not as vulnerable as and they are perilously vulnerable at the moment?
There's, I think, two things to say to that. I mean, I am, of course, aware of the no recourse to public funds because it's the condition on my visa as well,
Yeah.
even though I am in a sector of employment which is tremendously more prestigious, let's say, and easier to apply with, and which kind of is benefits from various kinds of government exemptions, which is the university sector, compared to the agricultural employment and especially the seasonal workers visas. So, from that perspective, I'd welcome any pressure that and any mitigation measures that the Scottish government can make in the current moment because um, they would help people in difficult circumstances. I don't know what can be done in practical terms because the no recourse to public funds is an issue which is uh, part and parcel of the infrastructure of the UK immigration regime. Anyone applying for a work visa in what used to be called the Tier 2 route cannot, for example, recoup some of the taxes that they pay um, as in form of a job seeker's allowance, for example. If I lose my job with the University of St Andrews, I have 2 weeks to leave the country
Mm-hmm.
because I cannot be employed by another body that is not the sponsor of my visa. So in that respect, all workers who are on work visas in the UK, and especially so the agricultural workers and others from Ukraine and from other countries, are very much like South Asian migrants in countries like Qatar and the United
Mm-hmm.
Arab Emirates who have their passports taken away
Yeah.
because you don't have the freedom to change the employer. I mean, this is a scandal, and I've had to revise my view of what the Western civilized world looks like when I came to this country. And I'm
No,
sorry for
you're
saying,
right. It's almost like a form of slavery. That they're bonded. They're like bonded slaves. They're bonded to the people who've brought them here, who sponsored them, and that is it. And it is an absolute disgrace. And it's something I don't think I was quite surprised when I was giving evidence to the parliamentary committee just how ill-informed most of the people. And this was a social justice committee, so there was some hope that they might have had a bit of a clue about social justice. Just how ill-informed they were about the issues. And the fact that obviously COVID and the pandemic has had a huge issue on that group of people because they were the very people who tended to lose their jobs. They weren't eligible for furlough, and the rest of it. And of course, necessarily couldn't physically be told to leave the country because nobody could go anywhere. So it is an issue that does need highlighted, and I'm hoping that this particular issue of the Ukrainians is enough to get people talking about it. I certainly hope so. One of the other disappointing things, of course, that happens whenever there is a war is that somebody's always able to make money out of it. And I'm afraid it looks like the oil and gas companies are looking at a bonanza from the war in Ukraine. They're facing a potential bonanza, though few in the industry want to admit it, and many are using soaring prices and the fear of fuel shortages to cement their position with governments in ways that could have disastrous impacts on the climate crisis. Oil prices have leapt dramatically to more than $130 a barrel, sending petrol prices in the UK to more than $1.55 a litre, while gas prices have also surged. The EU and the UK and the US have all announced drastic restrictions on imports of oil and gas from Russia, which will affect the EU most, as about 40% of EU gas comes from Russia, but will hurt all countries as prices are set internationally. Those governments are now urgently seeking ways to protect their energy security through ramping up renewables and seeking alternative sources of oil and gas. OPEC and Saudi Arabia in particular are the obvious ports of call, but have so far been reluctant to commit to increased production. This could change. As the FT reported, the United Arab Emirates ambassador to the US favoured an increase, news which sent oil prices down by about 11% from their peak. But the crisis gives Western oil and gas companies such as BP, Shell, Exxon and Total leverage among governments. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson defended oil companies against calls for a windfall tax. He said the net result of that would be to simply see the oil companies put their prices up yet higher and make it more difficult for them to do what we need them to do, divesting from dependence on Russian oil and gas. New oil and gas fields take years and even decades to come into production. So even if companies begin to expand their exploration immediately, it will not reduce current prices. Big oil and gas companies are now awash with cash, which they could use to invest in pumping more from existing fields and exploring new fields. Green campaigners warned that oil and gas companies were using the Ukraine emergency to further their own ends by encouraging governments to prioritise oil and gas production and make decisions now on investments that would have little impact on the current crisis, but would vastly increase fossil fuel use for years to come. It does feel in a way that COP26 hasn't happened. Douglas Ross in Parliament in Holyrood today was demanding that the Scottish Government relook at their decision not to proceed with, for example, explorations in the Cambo field, which actually wasn't a Scottish Government decision, it was a UK Government decision, and suggesting that it's about more oil, more oil, more oil. So not only does it make the oil and gas companies rich, it also tends to mean that the environment is going to be pretty screwed. Why? Why is it that war creates all of these connected disasters? I mean, this is one of your areas, is it not, of sort of expertise?
Um, I think part of the reason for that is that as a public we aren't willing to accept higher gas prices, and that come with that are higher energy prices that are partly the cost of getting off the oil and gas needle. This could be a moment when, if the public were willing to tolerate or put up with the prices, the government could push for a greater reliance on renewables. However, it's not going to do that because its reputation and its reputation in the polls is going to suffer. So unfortunately, we are seeing a short-termist logic here prevail once again, where we would need to see long-term leadership which could use the current situation and the current break of ties with Russia as an opportunity to promote the long-term agenda of the climate transition. However, no one likes to pay, for more for their heating, and I think it's as simple as that. And there is little appetite for the sort of sacrifices that divesting from fossil fuels would require.
So what you're saying is, it didn't matter that COP26 happened, even without the crisis in Ukraine, actually nobody's going to do the things that need to do to save the planet.
Do you think otherwise? Who is doing that?
Well, that's encouraging.
I'm sorry, I'm very pessimistic about that. Yeah.
I have to thank you so much for your contribution tonight for discussing issues around the Ukraine. I've got a couple of short domestic stories that I'll just share with our viewers. Is there any final message that you would want to give to people watching tonight about how you feel, what your hope is for Ukraine, what you think might happen, or any plea to people? Do people need to be better, do they need to understand more? Do they need to be better read about Ukraine? What do you want to say to people?
I think people need to have patience. The war is with us to stay, and I would like to see, hope that the outpour of support and of solidarity that has happened in the UK and in other countries is going to persevere. I mean, is going to be there because the refugees are going to keep coming out of Ukraine, and the war is going to keep going, and we all need to have patience in order to keep supporting the people who will need support.
Solidarity can be solidarity can be an extremely powerful thing. I see that on a daily basis, and I think sometimes people think it doesn't really matter, but I think if you're a person vulnerable and in need, to know that people have got your back, even if they're not there to necessarily do something physically for you, I hope is making a difference to people in Ukraine. I really fervently do hope. So thank you very much. By all means, stay on the line to hear what awful things are happening in the UK. But thank you very, very much indeed for your contribution this evening. So back home, there have been calls for the Chancellor to get his head out of the sand and properly tackle Tory cost of living crisis, hammering households, after new research revealed that households face being pushed further into debt and hardship due to rising costs. The findings from CompareTheMarket.com highlighted that more than 2/5, 42% of families with children living at home said they're expecting to take on extra debt to deal with rocketing energy bills. Nearly 20% of people without children at home think rising energy costs will push them further into debt, and around 33% of families with children stated they had struggled to pay household bills over the previous week. The survey was carried out in mid-February and prior to the further rapid rise in fuel prices. Separately, Energy UK warned last week that household energy bills could rise by another £1,000 by October as wholesale gas prices continue to soar, with households facing the prospect of bills between a staggering £2,500 to £3,000 per year. SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, "The Tory cost of living crisis is spiralling out of control, with families across the UK being pushed further into financial hardship and debt, a crisis made worse by the refusal to tackle soaring energy bills like other European states have. The latest warnings that households are expected to be burdened with more debt due to rocketing energy bills, and a significant number are struggling to pay those bills. This must serve as a wake-up call for the Tory government. The UK government's failure to get a grip has left millions of families worse off, and the reality is that many more are being forced into the impossible position of having to choose between heating and eating. The Chancellor must get his head out of the sand and use the upcoming spring statement to deliver a real package of measures to support households. That package must include, at the very minimum, turning the UK government's pitiful £200 energy loan into a more generous grant, reversing the £1,040 Tory cuts to universal credit, matching the Scottish Child Payment UK-wide, and delivering a real living wage. SNP MSP Karen Adams has called the UK government's lack of action to tackle the Tory cost of living crisis a dereliction of duty that is hitting women particularly hard. The MSP has highlighted the disproportionate effect the Tory cost of living crisis is increasingly having on women. Following an appearance from Jenny Miller, CEO of PAMIS, at Holyrood's Equality Committee this week, Miller spoke of the combined impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the rising fuel costs is having on women's financial security. Commenting, Karen Adams said, "When society is faced with challenging situations and tough decisions are made, it is more often than not women who bear the brunt of it." That's a powerful message to come in the same week as International Women's Day, and if we can point to anywhere in the world where we see that women are bearing the brunt of it, it surely has to be the Ukraine. And I'm going to finish with this press release that's just crossed my desk. It's responding to reports that Douglas Ross has withdrawn his letter of no confidence in Boris Johnson following repeated rule breaking. SNP leader Ian Blackford has said this is an utterly humiliating U-turn for Douglas Ross. Only a few weeks ago, he was categorical that Boris Johnson should be removed from Downing Street over his repeated rule breaking. Now, apparently, he will roll out the carpet for the Prime Minister at the Scottish Conservative Conference and pretend that the no confidence letter he submitted with such fanfare never happened. And of course, the entire Tory MSP group at Holyrood have backed Douglas Ross in his demand that Boris quit, so they will no doubt be furious that he's marched them up a hill and now they've left them looking ridiculous. And the Tories' weasel words that this isn't the time to pursue such issues is beyond hypocritical. This time last year, they tabled a no-confidence motion in the First Minister in the midst of a raging pandemic. It is ironic that having tried to get his boss removed from office, spineless Douglas Ross has ended up catastrophically undermining his own position and is no doubt on borrowed time as the apparent leader of the Scottish Tories. Well, we know the Tories are very, very fond of that phrase, "now is not the time." Unfortunately, we have come to the end of the time that we have had this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. A special thank to our guest tonight, Taras. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and please have a pleasant evening. Good night.